What's up, squad? It's your Squid, aka the Anxious Squid, here at Anxious Squid Productions. Thanks for clicking on the thumbnail or the title of the video. It's awesome to have you here. Today I'm coming at you with another video for my history playlist. So if you haven't seen one of my history videos before and you're wondering how they go, stick around. I reckon you might like this one. These guys are my patrons. If you don't know what Patreon is, in a nutshell, it's a way of giving me money. I like money, so turning some of yours into mine on a monthly basis would be ideal. If you want to support the channel but don't want to get hooked into that monthly stuff, you could buy my merch or buy something from Milkman Grooming using my discount code as a one-off instance of support. Check the link in the description below for all of the things that will make me money, or don't, whatever works for you. Today's video is about Lachlan Macquarie, who, full disclosure, I've always thought was a pretty nasty dude. Don't worry, I will list all of his achievements, and the purpose of this video is to have a discussion where we balance the good and the bad out, maybe try to make a decision based on merit, but I did just want to mention my personal bias from the outset. The chances are it'll be pretty evident as we go through the video. In short, I feel like people lean on the good more than the bad when remembering Lachlan Macquarie and his legacy. I'll try to be fair and not go too far the other way though. Lachlan Macquarie served as the fifth and last autocratic governor of New South Wales from the years 1810 to 1821, and he played a pivotal role in the social, economic and architectural development of the colony that would go on to become New South Wales. He had a crucial influence on the transition of New South Wales from a British penal colony into a free settlement. As a flow-on effect from that, he played a major role in the shaping of Australian society as we know it today. With that said, he also gave the direct orders that led to the genocide of the Gundagara and the Darawal people during what is known as the Appin Massacre in 1816, and that decision subsequently led to the genocide of many other cultures as well. I'll get to all of that after the jingle though. Hit the subscribe button, the like button, leave a comment below, and let's get into it, shall we? So I was talking with my grandmother the other day about my video on the Children Overboard scandal that occurred in 2001 in Australia, and you should watch that video after this one, incidentally, if you haven't already. It is in the history playlist like this is, but yeah, I was chatting with my grandma and somehow the topic of Lachlan Macquarie came up. You've really got to learn to take the good with the bad, she said when I called him a cunt off the cuff, before she dived into a diatribe where I'm positive her intentions were good, and where she was attempting to prevent me from hoisting my own modern moral feelings onto people from a different time period who supposedly had their own sets of morals within their own circumstances. And I've got to say, as a historian who's studied at universities from 4 different continents now, albeit not actually finishing any of those degrees, it's a pretty standard complaint that I hear from people in her age bracket. I've come to see that it's a common thread amongst the baby boomer generation, right? In an attempt to avoid society having what some of them call a black armband view of history, many people of that era find themselves advising younger generations to take the good with the bad. Except generally speaking, that perspective is only ever brought up or suggested when one starts mentioning some of the bad. Putting it bluntly, and calling a spade here, it's my experience that baby boomers who tell you to take the good with the bad actually just want you to flat out ignore the bad because it's stuff they either hadn't been taught, or it's stuff they've forgotten, or it's stuff they've deliberately ignored because it doesn't suit their already concrete, deified view of the person in question. Think about all the folks here in upstate New York, for example, right, who still watch O.J. Simpson highlights. Some people can ignore the alleged murder and focus on the Heisman Trophy and the movie Naked Gun and the 2,000-yard season, etc., etc. The same thing happens with Lachlan Macquarie in Australia, just on a much larger scale, where people focus on the building of roads and townships and ignore the multiple cases of genocide. Maybe I'm being too critical, though. We'll see, I guess. You can be the judge on our mate Lockie, all right? Leave me a comment letting me know what you think, if you think I'm off base, below. I'll start getting into the actual history now, though. Governor Lachlan Macquarie was born on the island of Ulva in Scotland on the 31st of January 1762. Both his mother and his father came from moderate means, with not a lot of information online in regards to their early lives. His father died while he was still young, as did his older brother, who incidentally was a prisoner of the American rebels in their war for independence. By the time Lachlan was of age, it's doubtful that he or his family name had enough prestige for him to attend the Royal High School in Edinburgh. What is known, though, is that in 1776, he volunteered for service in Her Majesty's Naval Forces, and in the following year, he obtained a paid position in her 84th Regiment, known as the Royal Highland Emigrants. Throughout a successful military career, Macquarie was stationed in a variety of Britain's colonial outposts. He served on the side of the British in the American Revolutionary War. He served for the British in the Caribbean islands during post-colonial conflict in that area. And he served in India, reinforcing colonial efforts for the Brits in the subcontinent as well. He would eventually go on to become Governor of New South Wales, the fifth and last of the autocratic governors to rule there, as I've said. He was appointed Governor of New South Wales in 1809 and took office early the next year, replacing the New South Wales Corps that had overthrown the previous Governor, William Bligh, in what we now refer to as the Rum Rebellion. And yeah, I know, I've been saying I'll do a video on the Rum Rebellion for about a year and a half now. I promise I'll get to it soon. The long and short of it is the free settlers revolted over rum, which they were using as a currency at the time, but you probably guessed that already from the title of the Rum Rebellion. Anyway, as Governor, Lachlan Macquarie began a program of public construction and town planning, and by about 1822 he had sponsored more than 200 separate works in the colony. It's not an overstatement to suggest that Macquarie was the main reason for the large amounts of architecture within the colony, as well as the roads to all of the major encampments within it. Speaking of roads, the law that states all vehicles must drive on the left side of the road in Australia, that was an edict by Macquarie that's lasted the test of time and is still in place today. He introduced the colony's own currency, not rum, and he helped establish the colony's first bank, originally called the Bank of New South Wales. The organisation's still running today, and if you're Australian, you've definitely heard of it. It's Westpac Bank. Macquarie approved of the rights to own land for white men who had previously been convicts. Ex-convicts couldn't own land in the colony prior to him, and he's the governor who approved the gifting of 300 merino sheep to free settler John MacArthur, which would indirectly lead to the commercial success of New South Wales as a whole based on merino wool sales. And I know I keep saying this, but I have a video on Johnny Mac, so check out all the videos in this history playlist if you've been vibing on this one so far. I want to be clear here for a second, right? It's a fact that Australia would not be the country it is today without Lachlan Macquarie's efforts. Banks, houses, businesses, other dwellings and all the roads in between them, he was a pioneer in the establishment of colonial rule within New South Wales, and therefore a pioneer for the establishment of a wider Australia as we know it. However, he did also directly commit genocide on the Darawal and the Gundagara people, and he's indirectly the reason many other groups of Aboriginal peoples suffered the same fate. So, taking the good with the bad, we're now going to look at those things a little bit closer as well. Before we do that though, regular viewers of this channel will know I enjoy zooming out and providing definitions or context for why the stuff we talk about happens, right? Before zooming back in at the topic at hand. So, let's start by agreeing what genocide actually is, what the definition is, and what actions you have to take to be tarred with that brush, right? The International Criminal Court defines the crime of genocide as characterised by the specific intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial or religious group by killing its members or by other means, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, or forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. That last one's a little on the nose for my American viewers, right? Australia has long revered the 5th Governor of New South Wales as an enlightened humanitarian who brought civilization to the colony. But if we're to use that metric of definition, and I am, it's undeniable that Lachlan Macquarie also committed genocide multiple times over. And we named a bunch of towns and a university after him. The Governor of New South Wales and his wife first visited the Appin region southwest of Sydney in 1810, and according to his own diary entries were met by 2 or 3 small parties of the cow pasture natives, who performed an extraordinary sort of dance. The local people of the area were Darawal people, whose territory spanned from Port Hacking and the Illawarra Escarpment west towards the MacArthur region and Campbelltown. Here, I'll show you a map. Incidentally, this is where I grew up. And it's where I lived before I moved to America. I grew up just around the corner from Appin. I had to drive through there to get to university every day, which is why I know about the massacre there. It's not taught in Australian history classes. Despite the British back then, and to some extent, Australians still today, actually, generally lumping all Aboriginal people in together as one homogenous group, the Indigenous people that the British viewed as being of the mountains had set themselves apart from other groups because they'd been active in defending their land from British pastoral theft in the years prior. The Gundagara people were on a cyclical and seasonal migration pattern, the same one they had been for generations, based around the growth and harvest of certain plants within the areas that they themselves had planted them. Not at all based upon hapless nomadic wandering as the British thought, or as you might have been taught in high school. While Aboriginal people did not have any perception of borders or nationhood on the whole, the Gundagara people were one of the few Aboriginal tribes that seemed accustomed to warfare, or one of the few that did not immediately back down when faced with a threat, at any rate. This made them especially dangerous, according to the British. There was, however, no recorded history of aggression from the Darawal people in the southwest region. Here's that map again in case you forgot. In reality, they do cross over a bit, the nations, because, as I said, they didn't really have any kind of physical or hard borders like the Europeans do. Most of the borders on this map are just rivers, in fact. Let's do a little experiment. I don't know if this will work, I'll edit it out if it doesn't, but here's the map of Aboriginal nations, and here's a map of all the rivers in Australia. Now, if my subconscious is right, those are pretty much the same map, just with different colours, right? Anyway, some Darawal men had accompanied Europeans Charles Throsby and Hamilton Hume on their early explorations in the area, which would lead one to think they were peaceful people at any rate, and they stayed mostly within the valleys and flatlands of the region, unlike the Gundagara, who hunted for food in the mountains. And yes, to my friends back home, Hamilton Hume is the dude the Hume Highway is named after. The good old M31, which is why it was named after him, right? That's the route he took. The more you know. When a drought occurred in 1816, the British thought that the Gundagara people came down from the mountains in search of food. In reality, they had a symbiotic relationship with the Darawal people and a somewhat common language, so they weren't actually searching for anything. They already knew where it was and where to go in time of need, much like the Darawal did in times of flood, but in reverse, they went upwards. It was at this point that the Gundagara people had started defending what the British saw as Darawal land instead of their own, though. After some Europeans were killed in conflicts brought about by pastoral encroachment and the subsequent retaliation, farmers began to arm themselves and a request was made to the Governor Macquarie to settle the issue. On April 9th, 1816, Macquarie ordered 3 regiments to lead a military expedition with secrecy and dispatch against the hostile natives in the Nepean region. A list with the names of all the people who were wanted in relation to violence was provided to each soldier. However, all Aboriginal people encountered were to be made prisoners of war or killed. In his own words, on any occasion of seeing or falling in with the natives, either in bodies or singly, they are to be called upon by your friendly native guides to surrender themselves to you as prisoners of war. If they refuse to do so, make the least show of resistance, or attempt to run away from you, you will fire upon them and compel them to surrender, breaking and destroying the spears, clubs, and waddies of all those you take prisoners. Such natives as happen to be killed on such occasions are to be hanged up on trees in conspicuous situations to strike the survivors with the greatest terror. The Appin Massacre occurred in the early hours of the morning of the 17th of April 1816. The official report states that at least 14 Aboriginal men, women and children were killed when soldiers under the command of Captain James Wallace shot at and drove a group of Aboriginal people over the gorge of the Cataract River. Diary entries of soldiers who were there, such as Captain Wallace himself, suggest that 14 deaths is a monumentally malicious misrepresentation of the massacre. His first-hand account reveals that under orders from Governor Macquarie, he, along with Captain W.B. Shaw and Lieutenant Charles Dorr of the 46th Regiment, led expeditions against Aboriginal people in the Nepean, Hawkesbury and Grosse Valleys, as well as the Liverpool district. He recounted in his diaries that they crept up on the Aboriginal people camped near Appin in the early hours of the morning on the 17th, and that he and his men fired upon the women, children and elders around the fire unprovoked. Following this massacre, fearing retribution, Macquarie issued a proclamation that outlined how Aboriginal people could not gather in groups of 6 or more near white settlements, and that peaceful Aboriginal persons should be issued with passbooks which told them where they were allowed in the colony and at what time of day. Incidentally, this passbook technique is one that would go on to be utilised with great fervour in apartheid South Africa, an enduring legacy for Macquarie and his style of leadership, right? After issuing the passbooks, Macquarie then reported the events of the Appin Massacre back to his boss in England via letter. Macquarie wrote to Earl Bathurst, and now you know where that town gets its name. In his writing, Macquarie is purposefully vague in how he articulates the events of the evening, and we know from historical records that no one involved in the massacre was brought to account after the fact, right? He swept it under the rug. He said to Bathurst that there was some resistance by the Aboriginals that had been slaughtered, and that among the dead were 2 of the most ferocious of the natives. He neglected to mention the unprovoked attack, women, children or elders. He concluded that his men had acted perfectly in conformity to the instructions I had furnished them. And unfortunately for all involved, the personal diary entries of the soldiers tell us basically the same thing. They did do what he asked. Like, he just left out the bits where he told them to become murderers in his recounting of the events, and he flat out lied about them not firing first. You can access the digital versions of all of the diaries I've mentioned for free via the Library of New South Wales if you don't want to take my word for it. The link is in the description, right? The archival records of his men reveal that there was absolutely no resistance by the Darawal people that night, and that this was a massacre, mandated by Macquarie, who wished to force European dominance upon the area. Macquarie saw this night as a success, and his violent scare tactics, masquerading as a strategy, would go on to be used widely within the colony for over a century afterwards. The Appin Massacre was the first government-sanctioned military engagement of Aboriginal people in Australia, but the decimation of culture would not stop there at the first. The Sydney Aboriginal communities were coerced into assimilation by the use of similar raids and subsequent hangings in the conspicuous locations. The events we've discussed throughout this video were followed by killings in the Bathurst region, on the northern coast, in the mountain ranges, in the Hawkesbury, along the Darling River, in Queensland, in Victoria. I could go on. In the exact same way that it wasn't an exaggeration for me to suggest earlier in the video that all of the infrastructure within the colony was a flow-on effect from a few Lachlan Macquarie decisions, it is likewise not an exaggeration to say that these military actions were as a result of him too. You can't have your cake and eat it. Either his legacy includes his influence, or it doesn't. If you're claiming Westpac, you need to own the fucking genocide. Governor Lachlan Macquarie was a talented politician by the standards of Europeans at the time. Without an iota of a doubt, he was a pioneer whose knowledge and leadership were the most influential of any single person in the creation of Australia as we know it, bar maybe Henry Parkes. He was also an invader that strategised to suppress and oppress Aboriginal people, and once that didn't work, he attempted to eradicate them completely. So let's do a little mental exercise where we balance the good with the bad, like the purpose of this video says, shall we? Other historical figures who have committed genocide are people like Slobodan Milosevic. Milosevic did a lot to advance the socialist cause in his nation and was hugely influential in the country's independence movement in post-Soviet Europe. His legacy is that of a bloodthirsty tyrant, though, because he committed genocide on the Bosnian people along the way. King Leopold II of Belgium, only the nation's second leader, secured the world's largest colonial outpost ever and was crucial to the creation of the global ivory trade, as well as the global rubber trade at the beginning of the automobile boom. And he is also remembered as a bloodthirsty tyrant, because he committed genocide on the people of the Congo along the way. Hell, even Adolf Hitler's scientists got us to the fucking moon when they moved to America, but the legacy of all of those people involved there is always going to be the Holocaust and nothing but, because genocide is bad, y'all. In case it wasn't obvious, I'm mentioning these heinous historical figures to illustrate my point that, generally speaking, when we as a collective are factoring in the good with the bad, genocide is usually considered pretty fucking bad, and something most people's legacy doesn't end up recovering from. Personally, I find it astonishing that Macquarie is remembered in the manner he is. Absolutely astonishing. The fact that so many people can flippantly disregard his record with Aboriginal peoples, I mean, it's not like we didn't have admirable people back then, you know? Like, we could replace him with our affections if we wanted to. I've done videos on William Dawes, the MacArthurs, Henry Anthill, Barangaroo. I'm working on a script based around what Contench, and there were men and women like Bennelong and Paddy Garang and Pemulwuy who were massively praiseworthy in their cross-cultural exploration. Contrary to popular belief, being a bigoted cunt was not simply the order of the day in that time period. Lachlan Macquarie wasn't just a product of his time that people like me now look back upon as horrible. He was a man who shaped his time deliberately to be horrible because it was easier than doing the hard yards of cross-cultural diplomacy. All you need to do is study his fractal relationship with William Dawes and Wat Contench to see there were good men who disagreed with him in the colony at the time. But like I said, The What Can Tench video is still being written. Many scientists of Macquarie's time, like the previously mentioned William Dawes and What Can Tench, absolutely abhorred the treatment of Aboriginal people by the militaristic aspects of the colony. Macquarie's own diary entries prove that it wasn't a matter of his ignorance. He knew Aboriginal people to be content, agricultural and civilised. It was just a different type of civilisation than the one he was used to back home in Britain. He commanded their eradication regardless. Like I said, you make up your own mind about Lachlan Macquarie and let me know in the comments. For me, whatever it's worth, and for whatever that's worth, genocide tarnishes a legacy to the point that it can't be saved. I feel great shame that my home country still holds this man in such high esteem. That's it for another video though, guys, and let me know what topics you'd like to see in the future. I'll see you when I look at you. You'll see me when you look at me. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you've enjoyed this video, and thanks very much for watching. Sorry if you thought I was attacking your grandma. I do love you. You're the best. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys.